Welcome to this video tutorial brought to you by Tutvid.com. Today we're going to take a look at creating this film effect. We're going to start with this image, we're going to apply some adjustment layers, change color, add some grain, things like that, and get this film effect. So if you're interested in learning about this and why I make all of the changes I make so you can create your very own film effect, follow along with the tutorial. We're going to get started right now. Alright, so it all starts right here with our raw file. Now you can download this alex.dng file over on the website www.tutvid.com. I'm going to have a link for it right down in the description for this video. So go check it out and you can follow along exactly here in Photoshop. We're going to begin by dragging this and dropping it in Photoshop. And what it's going to do, it's going to open that image in the Camera Raw editor. Now, full disclosure, this entire effect that we're going to create, I do much prefer to create effects like this in the Camera Raw editor or even in Lightroom or Capture One, something like that. But this is a Photoshop tutorial. I want to do it in the actual Photoshop UI, not necessarily in the Camera Raw interface. So just to let you know, that's how we're going to do it. It can be a little bit smoother if you work in the Camera Raw interface and also something like Capture One or Lightroom. But we're not going to dwell on that or worry about that. We're going to work with this image as it is. So we're going to hit Open Image to open this image up in Photoshop and get started. Now the first thing we need to do, and the first thing I'm going to do, is just clean up her skin a little bit. There's some markings on her skin and here on her shoulder. We're going to clean that stuff up. Actually, maybe I'll leave some of the bigger marks on the shoulders, but I'm going to clean it up right now using the healing brush. If you don't know how to use the healing brush, I have another tutorial on the healing brush, so I'm not going to get into it right now. I'm going to fast forward through this part of the video. You can watch me heal it up, and I will see you in just a second. Alright, and there we have it. So the forehead doesn't look quite as perfect as I would like it to, but it's just a quick, hacky job. We're not really necessarily concerned with that. We are going to jump in now and get started. We're going to use a series of adjustment layers, and I'm going to explain a little bit why I'm doing what I'm doing with those adjustment layers. We're not just going to apply them with reckless abandon. So in order to get started, let's actually just combine the blemishes and background layers together. So I'm going to hold down my Shift key and select both layers, just like so, and I'm going to go Layer, Smart Objects, Convert to Smart Object, just so we have it all kind of packaged up in its own little neat layer right here in our layers panel. Give it a second. It's a huge image that we're working with, 16 bits, the whole 9 yards. All right, we're going to go up to Layer, New Adjustment Layer, and we're going to choose Levels. We're going to begin with Levels. And we can name the levels layer whatever we like. Now the important thing is here, we're going to punch in some numbers. Typically I would drag this black point in. You can add contrast with that. You can add contrast in the highlights with the white drag or with the white color handle, whatever you want to call it. And then the output levels down here, if you drag up on the black, you're actually pouring light directly into the shadows, giving you this really hazy look, which is pretty cool. And then the opposite, really dulling the highlights by dragging the white handle. So here's what we're going to do. We're going to drag the black handle up to infuse some contrast into the shadows. And I'm actually going to pull the gray handle to the left, to right about there. We're going to brighten up the whole image generally. I'm going to leave the white handle there. I kind of like where my highlights are. Now I want to pump up some of the shadows a little bit. So I'm going to pull this over right about there. We'll leave it at 15 so it's easy to kind of remember for the future. And then I'm going to dull my highlights a little bit. Let's just make it 245, just like that. Pretty cool. All right, so now that we've done that, we're ready to add a curves adjustment layer. I'm going to use the adjustment layer panel, which is right here, and this is the curves adjustment layer. So boom, we do that, and you can see it throws a curves adjustment layer right in there for us. Now, what we want to do here is add some contrast. So I'm going to pull down on a point right about here, and then I'm going to click and add a point and pull it up just a little bit there. And I'm actually going to pull up the bottom point. That's going to really sort of dull my shadows a lot. You can see I'm starting to get this hazy look, right? You can see that really hazy effect that I'm getting. Pretty cool. It's a little bit too heavy, so I'm going to pull it down just a little bit. Maybe I'll flatten that out just a little bit more by adding another point right there. Something like so. All right, so there's before, there's after. You can see we're kind of adding a lot of contrast, but we are definitely dulling a big part of our shadows as well, which looks really neat. All right, so there we go. Now we're going to enter into the color channel. So with red, well, basically what I want to do is pull down a little bit down here. So I want to add some cyan to the shadows, and then I'm just going to pull up a little bit here on the upper part of the line, which is going to add a little bit of red to my highlights. And I'm going to go over to the green channel, and in the green channel, I want to almost do the same thing. I want to actually pull down here, which is going to add some magenta to the shadowy parts of the image. And I'm actually going to pull down a little bit on this top point, which is going to add some magenta to the highlights as well. And then I want to pull up on this point right here. So that's going to add a bunch of green to the shadowy parts of my image. Now you can see it looks like I'm getting a ton of pink. That's because as I pull up on this point, you can watch this part of the line, or this part of the curve, it really starts to bow down into the magenta area. The opposite of green is magenta, so if we pull down on the green line, we're going to get a lot of magenta. So with that in mind, I can see the green that I'm getting in the shadows by her hair and underneath her chin. So with that in mind, I'm going to leave that line right there, and I'm going to pull the rest of this line, the rest of this curve, back to kind of where it should be. So just apply a couple anchor points just to force it to go back to a straight line. You can see we get a more natural looking image, but we've got this really cool green hue in our shadows. I kind of like it. It's a really neat retro gritty effect. Now we're going to go over to the blue channel, and I'm just going to grab the bottom point and I'm going to slide it over to the right just a little bit. That's just going to, the opposite of blue is yellow, so that's just going to pump a little bit of yellow into the shadowy parts of the image, also influencing that green shadow that we were just working with. So all pretty neat. All right, so once we've done that, we're ready to apply a gradient map adjustment layer. The gradient map adjustment layer is this gradient icon here in our adjustment layers panel. By the way, if you don't have the adjustment layers panel open, it's window adjustments. So we're going to go ahead and apply a gradient. You can see we've got this really nice black and white image. We don't want black and white because we're going to use this with a blend mode. Right now, if I set this to a blend mode of, let's say, soft light, I get this crazy high contrast effect, which isn't necessarily terrible. Maybe if you reduce the opacity a little bit, it's a really neat way to infuse some contrast into your photos, just a thought. But that's not quite what we want to do here. We do want to work with a blend mode. We're going to get to that in a moment. Let's focus on the gradient map. Go ahead and click on the gradient stripe to open up the gradient editor, and we want to add a few colors here. So we basically want a darker gray going to a lighter gray, so we don't have that really, really strong contrast. So we're going to go ahead and select the darker here, and we're going to go with 4F, 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 which should be kind of a darker gray like that. And then we're going to double click on the white color stop, and we're going to choose AAA, AAA, which is a much lighter, but really not an extremely light gray. So you can see it's a very low contrast black and white image. That's exactly what I want. Hit OK, and we're going to set this to a blend mode of soft light. So we're going to go blend modes, soft light. So you can see there's before, there's after. We have this. It's kind of a nice amount of contrast that's added to the photo. So we're still preserving a lot of the vintagey texture and tones. So we can see here, there's the image we started with. Here's what we're up to. We've started to edit the colors, the tones, the shadows of the image, but we're still preserving the integrity of the overall image. So I like it. Now we're going to go ahead and choose the selective color adjustment layer. That's this little triangle looking one. So go ahead and hit that. And what we're going to do is we're going to start with the blacks. So from the colors, we're going to choose blacks. And basically, I want to adjust the individual colors that are showing up in the darkest parts of this image. So I'm going to leave cyan at 0. I am going to subtract the magenta. Now we're in the darkest parts of the image, so we want to infuse some green. The opposite of magenta, well, it's green. So we're going to go -5 on magenta. We're going to go -2 on yellow to throw a little blue in there as well. -2, -3, whatever works. That looks good. And then on black, we're going to go, well, we're just going to pull it back a little bit. Maybe we'll take it back to -10. You can see what that does to the photo. It pulls black out of the blacks, therefore sort of giving you this muddy, faded effect. Really, really cool. All right, next we're going to go into the colors and choose neutrals. And here in the neutrals, we're going to reduce some of the cyan. That's going to give us a little bit more red in our image. So -5 looks pretty good. We're going to do the same thing with magenta. It looks like there's a bit too much magenta, so we're going to add a little bit of additional green. There we go, -5. That looks good. And then we'll do the same with yellow. Let's take some of the yellow out. That's going to help balance the overall image. There we go, -5 on yellow looks good. And then let's increase the blacks here for the neutral. So let's just go +10 for the sake of keeping things easy to remember. That looks actually kind of cool at +10. All right, and last but not least, we're going to go to the old whites. And in the whites, we're going to do a little bit of the same. I want more red here in her face, so I'm actually going to take some of the cyan out. That's going to make the skin on her face a bit redder. That's cool. And we're also going to, well, let's try taking, see, I don't really want to take away magenta, so let's add some magenta. Something like that. Adding some magenta to the face, I actually kind of like that. And then we'll take away some of the yellow. So we'll pull that back to like -15. It almost looks a little bit chemically, but that's kind of cool. I like it for this strong film look. And we're going to leave black at 0. We don't really want to, subtract blacks and make the highlights too much stronger or really muddle our highlights by making them, adding a bunch of darkness to them. So we're going to leave that at 0. I like it. All right, so we've got our selective color adjustment layer. That's cool. Next up is going to be a hue saturation adjustment layer. That's this double gradient line looking icon. Hue saturation. And we're going to work really just with the reds because you can see there is a bit of red in her face. So we're going to move the hue of the red just a little bit. So I'm going to go right about there. +5 is good. It gives just a nice touch of yellow, just a nice yellow wash. And let's just remove some of the saturation. Now we're removing saturation just from the reds. Remember, we're working here in the reds. All right, and lightness. Actually, let's try to brighten it a little bit. It's going to brighten not just the highlights, but anywhere in the image that has this red tone. So it just gives a nice wash, healthy wash of light kind of to all of her skin tones. For a Caucasian, a white person, your skin tone is going to have typically a lot of red in it. So targeting reds and oranges is a good place to start if you're trying to adjust hue and saturation of somebody's skin tone with the hue saturation adjustment layer. All right. After that, we are actually going to move on to yellows. Let's just take a look at these. I'm not going to mess around with the hue. I kind of like what happened with the reds with the hue. That's cool. Let's try just dropping the saturation a bit. About right there. -30. That looks pretty good. And then if we brighten that also a little bit, we can take that up in brightness a little bit. Maybe around 25, 26, maybe 30 if we're feeling risky. Something like that. Whoop, didn't mean to do that. Let's just take it back to 25. There we go. Cool. All right, so we've brightened up the the yellows. We've desaturated the yellows as well. Next thing we're going to do is apply a photo filter. Now, the photo filter effect is this one right here. It's a little camera with a little circular filter in front of it. Photo filter. And I'm going to choose color. And the color I want, I have written down here. Where is it? All right, it's 3A 683B. It should be sort of this dark, not very saturated green, but not necessarily a desaturated green either. I hit OK, and I'm going to drag the intensity up until it's kind of a hefty effect, maybe 60. Let's leave it at 60%. I have preserve luminosity checked on. If I don't do that, it kind of does bad things to my image that I don't necessarily like. And once I've done that, I'm going to set the blend mode to multiply. It's going to really darken the image and give it this sort of underexposed, desaturated, low contrast effect. That's far too heavy though, so I'm going to reduce the opacity of that layer to about 30% or so. Yeah, let's just roll with 30% straight up. No, 31%, whatever. That's close enough. That looks pretty cool. Now, what I want to do, because we have sort of washed a bit of the color out, and I know you're probably thinking, well, we messed with the saturation and hue saturation. Why did we do that? Well, I kind of like the overall tone of the photo. I just want to boost the overall saturation. So we're going to do that by adding a vibrance adjustment layer, and I'm just going to drag the saturation kind of right about to there, so to 20. So you can see that's what it is with our vibrance adjustment. If we just shut off hue saturation, that's what it looks like. So it's a vastly different effect we're getting, especially with the skin tones, by using that hue saturation adjustment and then adding vibrance or adding really saturation later on. So next, we're going to apply another levels adjustment. And this is just going to help balance out some of the skin tones a little bit I'm seeing here on the face. So we're going to do that, and we're going to go to the green channel because there are a lot of greens. Remember, we have this green photo filter. We shifted the hues of the skin tones. So now we're going to sort of dial it back maybe just a little bit. So we're here in the green channel of this new levels adjustment layer, and I'm going to grab the mid-tone slider, and I'm going to shift it just to the left a little bit. All right, well, it looks like this is actually going to add some green. Do I want to do that? Do I want to take green away? No, I think I definitely do want to. I do kind of want to add some green. So we're going to go ahead and we're just going to leave that 1.1. That looks pretty good. 1.10 really on the input slider. And maybe what we'll try is go down here to the blue channel. And in the blue channel, we're going to grab this output. So this here, if we drag, is going to add a bunch of yellow to the photo. This is going to add a bunch of blue, but mainly you can see blue to the highlights. Well, how do we add blue to the shadows? We're going to add blue to the shadows with this down here. See, this is going to add yellow to the highlights. This is going to add blue to the shadows. So we're going to drag this maybe right about there. That looks pretty cool. It's kind of a really neat, almost lomography cross-processed effect that we're giving the image now. Kind of cool. All right, I like that. Now that we've done that, that is going to be the bulk of our toning. We might touch it up at the end, but let's just take a look. I'm going to Alt-click or Option-click this eyeball. That's what we started with. That's what we have now. Now you can see there's a little bit of banding back here. Don't worry about that. We're going to take care of that. There's some banding down here. I'm going to show you a cool trick to take care of any kind of banding you have in images. We're going to apply some high-pass sharpening. So we're going to do that by merging all of our visible multiple layers to a new layer by hitting Control-Shift-Alt, that would be Command-Shift-Option, and the letter E. It merges everything we've got, boom, to a new layer. That's what we've got. Now we're going to desaturate this. The hotkey is Command-Shift or Control-Shift-U, or you can go Image Adjustments, desaturate. See, Shift Control U, be Shift Command U on the Mac. Boom, black and white image. I like to do that. It purges all the color before we go Filter, Other, High. Oh, that's wrong. We want to go Filter, Other, High Pass. There we go. And I'm going to click on her eye, and we can see this. I actually think 2 pixels is going to work. So 2.0. Let's roll with that. And once we've done that, we're going to set this to a blend mode of overlay. All right. So you can see what happened. I'm going to zoom into 100% here. And I'm going to look at her eyes. There's with the high pass sharpening. There's without. There it is with. There it is without. With, without. So we're going to turn it on. All right, so now that we've got our first round of sharpening, we're actually going to apply a little bit more sharpening before we add grain, because I don't want to sharpen the grain. That can begin to really destroy the integrity of your photograph. So what we're going to do is we're going to merge all of these layers again using that Control-Shift-Alt, Command-Shift-Option-E trick that I just showed you. So we have all of this on a new layer, and we can even name this layer Smart Sharpen. Now, typically, it would be great. You can convert this to a smart object. We're not going to worry about that right now. We're going to live or die by what we do. So I'm going to go Filter, Sharpen, Smart Sharpen. And when I'm Smart Sharpening, I like to zoom in to my image 100%. So you can use Control or Command plus, even while you have this dialog open, and just zoom into your image. Oh. One more. There we go. This is 100%. So now that we're kind of checking out, we can see the skin tone, we can see her eyes, we can see the stray hair, all of that. I'm gonna, the amount of sharpening is just kind of really the amount of the effect, as you would expect. Radius, however, also contributes to the amount. Radius sort of dictates how big the edge to be sharpened is. And you can see we get really this nasty, chunky effect if we make the radius too big. I like to work with a very fine radius and really crank the amount up. So I'm going to set the amount to maybe like 170 or so, and set the radius to about 1.2. That looks pretty good. Let's untick preview. Turn preview back on. I am deliberately trying to over sharpen. Radius is just a little bit too high, 0.9. Maybe the amount is a touch too high as well. I'm trying to over sharpen it a little bit. I think it works with this effect, and we're going to have a bunch of grain going over this sharpened image. So there we go, 143 and 0.9. It looks like it works well for this image. So I'm going to go ahead and hit OK. I like the way it looks. It's going to take a second to process. No worries. And now we're going to go ahead and add some grain. So I'm going to zoom out. This is a pretty cool trick for adding grain. It's my favorite way to add grain. You go ahead and create a new layer. So we're going to go Layer, New Layer, and I'm going to name it Grain. All right, once we have our grain layer, we go Edit, Fill, set the contents to 50% gray. Great, boom, okay, we got it. Filter, Noise, Add Noise. We're going to add about 50% of noise. Here, this is very important. Distribution should be uniform, and you want to tick on monochromatic. If you don't have monochromatic, you've got all kinds of multicolored noise. Doesn't look very good in a photo. Not typically anyway. There are some cool things you can do with non-monochromatic noise though, so keep your mind open to that. But in this case, we're going to use monochromatic noise. Hit OK. Looks beautiful. And now we actually want to duplicate this layer. So Command or Control J is the hotkey to duplicate, and I'm going to name this Grain Large. What we're going to do with this layer, I'll just zoom into 100%, is we're going to increase the size of this by going Edit Free Transform, and right here we have width and height. I'm just going to set the width and height to 250%. 250%. Hit OK. It's going to re-render, and you're going to see we've got all this blurry, chunky noise now. All right, we set this layer to the blend mode of Soft Light. It interacts with the grain beneath it, and we set the original grain layer also to the blend mode of Soft Light. Now we have both of our noise layers wreaking havoc and, for all intents and purposes, doing a ton of damage to our original image, but it kind of looks cool. However, we're not going to keep this really, really strong grain effect. We're going to reduce the layer opacity of the large grain. Well, before I do this, I do typically like to have my larger grain lower on the opacity scale. I don't like to see it as much. I like it to be more of a subtle texture, and then the finer grain can be a little bit more noticeable. So I'm going to reduce the opacity to about, I don't know, 30%, something like that. Let's try that. And then for the finer grain, we're just going to reduce it to maybe 70%, something like that. So you can see without grain, with grain. So it really begins to pump this retro effect. Now you might think that's way too much grain. If so, knock it down. By all means, be my guest. Go ahead and do it. Now, it's quick side note, a lot of really, really good retouchers have these grain layers that they keep above everything they're retouching. So maybe they'll start a new project, they'll create 2 layers of grain or a few layers of grain. Some use one, some might use a number of them, set to all different opacities, to whatever looks good, because you can see what it does to the skin. It gives it this beautiful uniform texture. It just really works well. We had that lighting issue up here on our forehead where we had to clean up a big blemish, but the grain really just kind of helps smooth everything and give a very pleasing, even skin tone in general. So there we have it. We have this finished effect. And actually, before I let you go, one last thing. I maybe want to just add a little bit more of a fade effect to this. I like where it is. Let's just try adding another selective color adjustment layer. Go to the blacks and just remove a little bit more of the black. Maybe go -10 on the blacks. Maybe that's a little bit too much, actually. Maybe -5, something like that looks cool. And you can see just lifting the blacks just a smidgen more right before we walk out the door. And there you have it. A film, grainy, retro, flat effect that you can apply to any image you want. Go through this again and set in action. You can have a Photoshop action, or use this as a reference image. Remember, you have curves. You have a lot of these tools, split toning and temperature for photo filter. You have vibrance and saturation in the Camera Raw editor in Adobe Lightroom. You can do all of this stuff in Camera Raw, in Lightroom, in Capture One. It just takes a little bit of experimentation and knowing why you're doing what you're doing. Don't just follow this like a recipe. Follow this like a strategy. So if you know why I'm doing what I'm doing, you can go out and create any of these effects that you want. Maybe you don't want one that's warm and green. Maybe you want something that's very cold and harsh. Well, with all the information you have here, you should be able to go ahead and create something that's cooler and has a little bit more of a harsh edge to it. So that is it for this one. Get over to the website, tutvid.com. There's a bunch more free tutorials there you can check out. You can download this photo there. You can get the resources you need to follow along exactly with me in this video tutorial. And there's a bunch of other great stuff you can check out there. Plus, if you visit my site, you support me, and that's super cool. So that's it for this one, guys. Thank you so much for hanging out with me, watching this. I hope you learned something. Take it easy.